It was the photograph. He had not expected it. He had not expected any of it. Not the assignment, not the building, not the particular quality of the November light coming through the atrium glass. But it was the photograph that stopped him. It was mounted near the elevator bank on the 14th floor, part of a row of portraits that law firms put up because they believe portraits communicate something about permanence. Most people walked past them without looking. Malcolm Carter was not most people, and so he looked, the way he always looked at things, carefully, without hurry, the way you look when you've spent enough years reading what a room is trying to tell you. The woman in the portrait was in her early 40s, dark jacket, hair pulled back with a precision that suggested she had opinions about precision. The nameplate beneath read, Audrey Sinclair, partner, litigation. Malcolm stood there for a moment longer than was professional. Then he turned and pressed the elevator button and said nothing to the junior associate who had come to meet him, because there was nothing that needed to be said. He had not seen Audrey Sinclair in 22 years. He had last seen her at a kitchen table in a house in Kamloops, the summer he was 29 and she was 20, and she had pushed a folded piece of paper across the table and said, quietly, "Read it when I'm gone." He had not read it when she was gone. He had put it in the breast pocket of a jacket he stopped wearing, and eventually the jacket had gone to a donation bin somewhere on Robson Street, and that had been that. He had thought, over the years, that he had handled it well. He was a forensic accountant. He handled things. Malcolm Carter had been brought in by the firm to conduct an independent financial review. Chambers & Lowe was one of Vancouver's older litigation firms, and they were defending a class action involving a construction developer who had allegedly misrepresented project costs to a series of municipal clients across British Columbia. The managing partner, a man named Stuart Chambers, had called Malcolm's firm in October and said they needed someone meticulous, someone who could read 14 years of invoices and find the story. Malcolm was 48 years old and had been finding the stories in numbers for 23 of those years. He had spent 8 of them as a partner at an accounting firm in Calgary before opening his own practice. He had a daughter named Elise, who was 17 and lived with her mother in Kelowna. He owned a 1-bedroom apartment near English Bay. He kept his desk clean and his shelves organized and his phone on silent during working hours. He had not, in the 3 weeks since Stuart Chambers had called, thought about Audrey Sinclair. He would not have been able to tell you why, except that he had become very good at not thinking about things that had no active bearing on the present. The present, until that photograph, had felt uncomplicated. He was shown to the office they had prepared for him on the 14th floor, a spare room at the east end of the corridor with a window overlooking the harbor. The materials were already there. 6 boxes of financial records, 2 laptops, an access card for the secure document portal. The associate who had shown him up, a young man named Oliver Firth, told him the billing coordinator would come by at noon. He nodded. Oliver Firth left. Malcolm sat down, opened the first box, and began to read. He did not see Audrey that day. He saw her on the 3rd day. He was coming out of the records room with a stack of binders when she came around the corner from the other direction, and for half a second there was nowhere for either of them to go. She registered his face in the way that people register something they were not prepared to process. He watched her do it. He watched the moment of calibration, the recognition, the containment, and he recognized it because it was exactly what he was doing himself. "Malcolm," she said. "Audrey," he said. The corridor was narrow. There was no one else in it. "You're the forensic accountant," she said. I didn't know they were using your firm. I didn't know you were here." A pause. The kind of pause that is not empty. "I'm the lead counsel on the file," she said. He nodded. "Then we'll be working together." She looked at him for a moment, the same way he had looked at her photograph 3 days earlier, carefully, without hurry, and then she said, "I suppose we will," and walked past him toward the elevator bank. He stood there for a moment. Then he went back to his records room and opened the next binder, and he did not look up from it for 3 hours. What he remembered about Audrey Sinclair from before was not dramatic. That was the thing he had thought about, occasionally, in the years since. There had been nothing operatic about it. She had been his sister's university friend, brought home one Thanksgiving to a house in Kamloops where the Carters had been gathering for 4 generations. She had grown up in Cranbrook, she said. Her father had been a mill worker, retired early with a bad back. She wanted to be a lawyer. She said it in the way some people say things. Not with ambition, exactly, but with a kind of quiet certainty, as if the decision had been made years before and she was simply reporting it. Malcolm had been 29 that Thanksgiving, back in Kamloops between contracts, staying a week longer than he'd planned. He had noticed her the first evening, at dinner. He had not said anything about noticing her for 3 days. By the time he did, they were sitting on the back porch in the cold, and she had his jacket around her shoulders because she'd come outside without hers, and he had said, without planning to, that he would like to see her again when he was back in Vancouver. She had looked at him in a way he had not known what to do with. Not hesitation. Something more complicated. "You're always back in Vancouver," she said. "You're never actually there." He had not been able to argue with that. They had continued for 7 months, in the way of two people who are not wrong for each other, but are working on very different timelines. She had 2 years of school left. He was building a practice that required, in those years, the kind of attention that didn't leave much room for anything else. He had told himself he was being realistic. He had told himself that she would understand. She had understood. That was the part he had never quite made peace with. She hadn't left angry. She hadn't left with accusations. She had come to his apartment on a Tuesday evening and said that she thought they were both waiting for the other one to make a decision. And neither of them was going to. And that seemed like a decision in itself. He had not disagreed. She had left him the note at the kitchen table the following weekend, when she came to collect a jacket she'd left. He had been at the office. She had let herself in with the key he hadn't asked her to return. "Read it when I'm gone," she had said, and he had not. He had thought for years that this was fine. He had thought, very occasionally, that it was perhaps not entirely fine, but also not something that required action. He had not thought about it at all until 3 days ago, standing in the corridor outside the elevator bank on the 14th floor of Chambers and Low. The work kept him busy. It was the kind of file that rewarded patience, years of overlapping expenditures, deliberately obscured contractor relationships, invoices that had been processed through 3 different holding companies before landing on a municipal balance sheet. There was a story in it. Malcolm could feel the shape of it before he could articulate it, the way you feel the structure of an argument before you have the words. He crossed paths with Audrey 3 times in the first week. Once in the hallway, once in the document room, where they stood at opposite ends of the same table for 40 minutes without speaking beyond what the work required. Once at the coffee station where she filled her mug and he filled his, and they stood side by side for a moment before she said, "How's the file?" And he said, "Complex," and she said, "They usually are," and left. He noticed, without deciding to notice, that she wore no rings. He noticed, without deciding to notice, that she moved through the office with a particular quality of self-possession that was different from what he remembered. Not cold, not closed. It was more like the self-possession of someone who had learned, over a long time, to make herself very hard to read. He wondered if people who did not know her could see how much it cost. He thought that was probably not his business. The difficulty arose in the second week, in the form of a man named Philip Drummond. Philip Drummond was the senior partner on the defendant's side, a man in his late 50s with the particular confidence of someone who had spent decades being given things he asked for. He came to the 14th floor on a Tuesday afternoon, not to review documents, but to talk to Stuart Chambers about expediting the timeline, and he walked through the floor with the unhurried entitlement of a man who did not fully distinguish between walking through a space and owning it. Malcolm was in the records room when he heard Drummond in the corridor, talking to Stuart about the financial review. He was not intending to listen, but the walls in this building were thin, and Drummond had a voice designed to carry. "I don't see why an independent reviewer is necessary," Drummond said. "We've already provided certified statements." Stuart said something Malcolm couldn't make out. "That's her position," Drummond said, and the way he said her had a particular quality. "Of course it is. She's been looking for leverage since the first filing. You want my advice, Stuart. You don't let a litigator run a financial review. That's not her file to control." There was a pause. "It's not about control," Audrey's voice said from somewhere Malcolm couldn't see. "It's about accuracy, which I'd think everyone in this room would want." Another pause. Longer. "Of course," Drummond said. Malcolm went back to his binders. An hour later, when the corridor was quiet again, he found himself thinking about what it took to say a thing like that. Of course, to a man like Drummond, in a tone like that without any visible effort. He thought about how much practice that took. How many rooms like that one? He thought about the note he had never read. He left the building at 7:15. He stood outside on Georgia Street for a while, watching the traffic, and then he walked to the coffee place on Burrard and ordered something he didn't particularly want and sat there until it was time to go home. The gala was Chambers and Lowe's annual client dinner, held at a hotel in Cole Harbor at the end of the third week of November. Malcolm had not expected to be invited. He was brought in as an external reviewer, not a client. But Stuart Chambers had called him the week before and said, in the way that was half invitation and half instruction, that it would be good for the file if he attended. He attended. He arrived at 7, at the same time as a small cluster of municipal lawyers from the other side of the file, and he stood at the edge of the reception room with a glass of water. He did not drink at work events, and watched the room arrange itself. These were not his people particularly. He had spent enough years at events like this to know how to be present without being conspicuous, and he was good at it in the way that some people are good at things that do not make them happy. Audrey arrived at 7:20. She was wearing something dark green that he did not pay attention to the details of, because paying attention to the details of what she was wearing seemed like an indulgence he had not earned. She came in with 2 younger colleagues, said something that made them laugh, and then scanned the room with the particular efficiency of someone who wants to know the terrain before they commit to it. She found him standing at the edge, and she looked at him for a moment, and then she crossed the room. "You don't look like you want to be here," she said. "I don't particularly want to be here," he said. "Neither do I." She picked up a glass from a passing tray. "Stuart asked you to come." "Yes, he asked me too." A pause. "He thinks it demonstrates cohesion, does it?" She looked at the room. "It demonstrates attendance." He found himself, without planning to, almost smiling. He did not smile, but the almost was there, and she must have seen it, because something shifted slightly in her expression. They stood there for a moment side by side, watching the room with the same quality of detachment, and he was aware, with a precision that surprised him, of how familiar this felt. Not comfortable, exactly familiar. "Drummond is here," she said. He looked. Drummond was across the room near the bar, talking to 2 men in municipal-looking suits. "I know," Malcolm said. "He went to Stuart last week about the review. Did you hear? I heard some of it." She was quiet for a moment. "He wants to narrow the scope, limit it to the 2019 and 2020 fiscal years." Malcolm turned to look at her. "The discrepancy I'm finding in 17, I know, if the scope gets narrowed, it disappears," she said. "Yes." He looked back at Drummond. "Has Stuart decided?" "Not yet." She took a small sip of her drink. "I told him I'd object to any scope change that wasn't supported by a recommendation from the independent reviewer." A pause. "That's my recommendation to make," Malcolm said. "I know that," she said with a patience that contained very finely the message that she was aware of exactly whose recommendation it was to make. He looked at her. "I'm not trying to run your file," she said. "I know, I just wanted you to know where I stand." "I know where you stand," he said, and meant it in more than one sense, and thought she probably knew that too. Drummond left the gala at 8:30. By 9, the room had thinned, and Malcolm and Audrey ended up at a table near the window, with 2 other people who excused themselves at 9:15 to catch a ferry. After that, it was just the 2 of them, and the harbor, and the particular silence that had been sitting between them for 3 weeks. "You never read it," she said. He did not pretend to misunderstand her. "No," he said, "I know." She looked at the window. "I came back for the jacket the following week. It was still in your pocket." He had not known that. "I almost took it back," she said, "the note." A pause. "I left it anyway." He thought about the jacket. He thought about Robson Street. He thought about the 12 years he had spent in Calgary before the move back to Vancouver, and the practice he had built, and the marriage that had been good for a while, and then, quietly, had not been, and Elise at 17 with her mother's eyes and her father's habit of observing before speaking. "What did it say?" he asked. She turned to look at him. "I'm not sure I remember exactly," she said, which he did not entirely believe. "What did it say?" he said again, not unkindly. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, a float plane crossed the harbor, a slow blinking light moving from right to left. "It said that I thought you were the most careful person I had ever met," she said, "and that I thought that sometimes you were so careful you forgot to hold on to things." He sat with that for a long time. "I put it in a jacket I stopped wearing," he said. "I know, I didn't know you'd come back for it." "I know that too," she said. Philip Drummond filed a formal request to narrow the review scope on a Wednesday morning. He sent it to Stuart Chambers with a copy to the managing committee and a note that framed it, with a precision Malcolm had to acknowledge as competent, as a matter of efficiency rather than obstruction. Malcolm spent Wednesday afternoon writing his recommendation. He was not a man who used more words than the situation required. His reports were known in his field for a certain economy, the ability to state a complex finding in 3 sentences where others used 15. He had cultivated this not out of style but out of respect for the time of the people who had to read what he wrote. His recommendation ran to 9 pages. He documented the 2017 discrepancy in full. He traced the contractor relationship through all 3 holding companies. He showed, with the particular care he brought to things he needed to be unambiguous, exactly how a narrowed scope would make the discrepancy invisible and exactly why that would be a misrepresentation of the financial picture. He noted at the end that limiting a review's scope in response to one party's preference rather than the evidentiary record was not a practice he could endorse, and that he would withdraw from the engagement rather than participate in a review that had been designed to produce a specific outcome. He sent it to Stuart at 5 o'clock and copied it to Audrey. He did not hear from Stuart that day. He heard from Audrey at 5:45. Her email said thank you. 2 words. He sat with them for a moment in his spare office with the harbor window, the way he sat with things that had more in them than they appeared to. He replied, "Let me know what Stuart decides." She replied a minute later, "He'll hold the scope. Drummond won't push it further, there's too much on record now." He replied, "Good," she replied, "Yes." Then, after a pause of perhaps 3 minutes, "Do you want to get coffee, not in the building?" He looked at that for a moment. "Yes. Tomorrow at 8. There's a place on Burrard," she replied. "I know the one." It was a Wednesday morning, the last week of November, and the coffee place on Burrard was quiet at 8 o'clock, the way it is only in that particular window before the city fully starts. He was there first. He ordered for both of them because he remembered how she took her coffee, and it did not occur to him until she sat down and saw the cup that she might not take it the same way anymore. "You remembered," she said. "I wasn't sure if I should," he said. "You got it right," she said, which meant something slightly beyond the coffee. They sat there for a long time, longer than either of them had probably planned. They talked about the case, briefly, and in the way of 2 professionals who are not trying to hide from a harder conversation behind a professional one. They talked about Elise, whom Audrey had never met but had somehow known about, because Malcolm's sister had kept her loosely informed, over the years, through the comfortable irreverence of the group chat they'd both somehow never left. He had not known that. "She sent me a photo once," Audrey said, "when Elise was maybe 4. She's got your eyes. She's got my general approach to situations," he said. "Which concerns me more." Audrey looked at him. "What's wrong with your approach?" He looked at his coffee. "I'm told I'm very careful." The pause that followed was the kind that doesn't need to be filled. "I've been in this city for 11 years, she said. "Since I finished my articles in Ottawa. I've been back for 6, I know." She did not explain how she knew. He did not ask. "I saw your name in the Law Society newsletter a few years ago. Forensic Accounting Review, something to do with a pension fund. The Meredith case," he said. "I read the summary," she said. "You were. It was very thorough." "I'm told I'm thorough," he said. She smiled, very slightly. It was the first time he had seen her smile, properly, without the professional management of it, since she had walked back into his field of vision 3 weeks ago. It was not a large smile. It was the kind that costs something to give. "I'm not the same person I was in Kamloops," she said. "I know that. I've been a different version of this person for a long time now." She looked at the window, the street outside, the November gray. "I made choices that made sense and some that I still think about. I know the feeling," he said. "I'm not saying that as a problem," she said. I want to be accurate about it. I'm not easy to be around. I'm very particular about my work and where I put my attention, and I've organized my life around that for a long time, and some of that isn't going to change." He looked at her. "I'm a forensic accountant," he said. "I find things people have hidden in places they thought no one would look. Accuracy is not a problem." She held his gaze. "I left because you were so careful you forgot to hold on." "I know," he's next said. "I read the note." A pause. "The genuine kind. You said you didn't." "I went to the donation bin," he said. "I don't know why. I think I knew on some level." He looked at his coffee cup. The jacket was still there. "Whoever sorted the donations hadn't gotten to it yet. I don't know why I went. I told myself I went for the jacket." She was very still. "I read it in the parking lot," he said, "and then I drove home. And I thought about calling you, and I didn't." "Why not?" He was quiet for a moment. The honest answer was not a flattering one, "Because I decided it was too late, and because deciding it was too late was easier than not being sure." Audrey looked at him, the window, back at him. "It wasn't too late," she said. "It was a long time ago and a lot has happened and I'm not the same person, but it wasn't too late." He did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that was proportionate to that. I'm not saying we can pick up where we left off, she said. That would be, no, that's not what I'm saying. I know, he said. I'm saying that I'm in this city, she said. And you're in this city. And I think we both know that the reason we handled this so professionally for 3 weeks is that we're both extremely good at managing things we don't want to look directly at. He was quiet. That's accurate, he said. So she put her hands around her cup. I'm looking directly at it, that's all. He sat with that for a long time. Outside, the street was filling, the city finding its rhythm, the particular Tuesday morning logic of people who know where they are going. He thought about the records room on the 14th floor, and the 9-page report he had written, and Drummond's face at the gala when Audrey had said, of course with that particular economy. He thought about Elise, who had his eyes in his reserve, and who texted him on Sunday evenings with questions about tax law she had learned from him, but phrased as if she'd discovered them herself. He thought about a kitchen table in Kamloops, a piece of paper pushed across it, a jacket on a donation bin. I think coffee is a reasonable place to start, he said. She looked at him, and this time the smile was not the managed kind. It was small and it was careful, and it was the kind that you give when you have not given it in a long time and you are not entirely sure of the ground beneath it, but you are giving it anyway. Coffee is a reasonable place to start, she said. The review concluded in February. Drummond's client settled out of court before the report was formally filed, which was not unusual where the evidentiary record had been given sufficient room to speak. Stuart Chambers sent Malcolm a brief note of thanks. Audrey said nothing about it in the email thread they were still, quietly, maintaining. They had moved off work topics somewhere in December, neither of them acknowledging the transition directly. She had told him, in January, that she had kept the first note he had ever sent her. Not an email, a card. He had sent it after that Thanksgiving in Kamloops, a week after he'd gotten back to Vancouver, and he had not known what to write, so he had written only his phone number and, underneath it, in case you want to continue the conversation. She had called him 2 days later. He had not remembered sending the card. He was not sure what it meant that she had kept it. He thought it probably meant something he was not going to rush to name, because some things were better grown into than declared. He had told her that, she had said with a dry precision he had been relearning to appreciate. Well, you're taking the careful approach. I'm taking the accurate approach, he said. I know, she said. I'm starting to think those might be the same thing. It was early March by the time they had dinner that was not coffee and not professional. A small place on Main Street that she had been going to for years, and he had walked past a dozen times without going in. She had gotten there first and was sitting by the window, and when he came through the door she looked up and did not do the thing where you pretend you weren't watching for someone. He sat down across from her. Outside, the city was doing what Vancouver does in March, something between winter and spring, never quite committing, the mountains visible for the first time in weeks above the low cloud. Good view, he said. She turned to look. I always sit here for it. They ordered. They talked. The evening had the quality that some evenings have, not memorable in any particular moment, but in its entirety, the way it settled, the way the hours moved without either of them checking the time. He thought, walking home along Main Street afterward, about the careful approach and the accurate approach, and whether they were the same thing. He thought they might be. He thought that being careful, done right, was not about protecting yourself from things. It was about paying enough attention to know what was worth holding on to. He had not been wrong about the approach. He had only been wrong, once, about what he was applying it to. That was something he could work with. He walked home through the March evening, the mountains still visible in the last of the light, and he thought that this, whatever this was at the beginning of it, was the kind of thing that did not need a name yet. It needed time. It needed the same patience he brought to a records room full of evidence that was not yet speaking clearly. He was good at that. He was, it turned out, still learning to be good at the other thing. But he was learning, and that for now was enough.